This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, Sam, as always.
Always a pleasure. Something I will update our listeners on. If you haven't followed our, we do have a YouTube channel, the Blackaby Ministries. Yeah. Just a general channel for videos that we've put out. Some of it's, there's some of your preaching on there.
Hallelujah.
Some of your dad's preaching from back in the day, just other various things. Mm-hmm. But we've several months ago, last summer actually, we took a trip to Oxford. We mentioned it a few podcasts ago. I've finally edited all of the videos that we shot over there. Just little excerpts of interesting things around Oxford. Obviously, Oxford has loads of history, and so Richard was just foaming at the mouth to be able to talk about some of these places. And
it was glorious.
So we got to film a few things, like we toured the kilns where C.S. Lewis lived. And we looked at
Blenheim Palace,
Bodleian Library, Latimer and Ridley, and even traced back some of your heritage to a small little church in the Cotswolds in Oxford, or just outside of Oxford.
Had a Blackaby minister back early in the Baptist history.
Early on, yeah. So anyways, all that to say, check out the YouTube channel. You can search Blackaby Ministries on YouTube. Sure. And we've got a lot of those clips out there. Another thing, development, is if you own an Amazon smart speaker, you can say to that device, play the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, and it'll play it, which is kind of neat. Technology.
Wow. I need to say, give the next leadership podcast.
give me leadership podcast ideas. That's what we need. So just another way for you to listen. But anyways, all that housekeeping aside, it's good to have everyone with us on another episode. And today we are looking at something that I think a lot of people would say goes hand in hand with leadership, and that's influence. And Maxwell has popularized the idea that leadership is really ultimately about influence. And of course, if you go back to the early episodes, we talk about this and how we take a slightly different tack on the idea of influence, but really in a culture today of influencers, you may hear this term. If you have a following on any social media platform, you're oftentimes considered an influencer. But the question we want to ask is how do you become a person that has influence? That when trouble hits, you are the person that other people look to for advice and for leadership and for guidance. Yeah. And so with that, Richard, can you walk us through some ways that we can do that?
Well, and I may have mentioned before, but I remember growing up and seeing two different contrasting things. On the one hand, I watched my dad, and my dad was an ordinary person. He pastored a relatively smaller church, small to maybe mid-sized at best, and yet he had a huge influence, and he was being asked to speak all over the place, ultimately to write, and people, even back in the day, would be asking to come and just spend an hour or two in the evening, and they'd have they'd sit there in our living room with a list of questions they just wanted to ask my dad, and a person that people just wanted to hear from, and just they wanted to know what he thought. And here's where I'm coming down on this, but Henry, I really want to know what you have to say. And then at the same time, I saw other people who desperately wanted to be that kind of person. They wanted to be the kind of person that people made appointments to talk to because they wanted to know what they thought, or there was a convention meeting and people said, well, we'd like to hear from so-and-so. And but some of these folks, although they wanted to have that kind of influence, it was clear they didn't have it. Yeah. And I'll never forget being in some of those meetings of my denomination years and years ago, and there'd be an issue that was being discussed, and inevitably there'd be a couple of these pastors And you just knew that they loved being behind the microphone. They loved having everybody listen to them, and they had the limelight. And so they would get up and they were trying to say something profound, but they weren't getting there. And so they'd try to say something that really wowed the audience and seemed so insightful, and it would just fall flat. And then they'd go sit down and the next person would talk. And then a little while later, the same person would come back up trying to give it another run this time, and I thought of something else. And
one more thing.
And they were usually breaking Robert's Rules of Orders to come back a second time, but they would come back a third and fourth time. And every time it was obvious, why does this person's spoken 4 times now and they haven't still made a contribution? They wanted to, they were trying to, but you could just see people almost rolling their eyes when certain people would get to the microphone. It's like, oh no, we got more of him. And I saw the contrast there, and I remember even just as a child thinking, Lord, help me never to be that kind of person who's desperately wanting to be taken seriously, but I'm not. And then people that don't have to go to the mic, they don't have to try to weasel their way in front of the audience. They just carry clout just by who they are and by the fact that they have a track record that people know and they admire. And so this is all about how do you become that kind of person? And certainly now with the advent of social media, everybody is trying to somehow be that person, so that they post something on Twitter or they post something on Facebook, and then they're watching every hour to see, did anybody like what I said? Anyone followed me because of that statement? And well, maybe I'll try to say something a little bit more edgy next time. I'll try to say something that gets everybody's opinion and or involvement. And sometimes I read stuff on social media, and it's almost like a desperate plea for someone to notice them.
Which is really what all social media boils down to.
It's so much of it, yeah. So you look at that and you just say, boy, I tell you, because now social media, of course, has given people a platform. It used to be, like I said, you went to an annual convention and you kind of had one shot at it every year. Now you just sit at your laptop and you can have an audience at any time. And so that has sped things up and made it much more pervasive. And so several things I would say in terms of how do you become the kind of person that when you say something, people lean in and listen? And the first one is simply have something to say, have something of value to say. Everybody has something to say, but when we live in a culture that tries to convince us that everyone's opinion has equal value, which of course is nonsense. Everyone has perfectly the same right to express their opinion. Yeah. That doesn't mean that every opinion is of equal value.
I think that's a huge distinction, because I think there's so many who want to sort of equalize everything and say, hey, we're all just humans with we all have equal opinions, and as utopian as maybe that sounds, or as it may be coming from a good place, but it's certainly not the case.
Yeah, and I give the example. You might be sitting at Starbucks having coffee with a friend, and do you hear someone at the table next to you saying, "Hey, I just bought this stock on the stock market, and I really think it's going to take off and go places." Well, if I hear someone say that, I'm probably going to just listen in and listen to what is that stock, and but I'm not going to necessarily race out and clear out my savings account and buy that stock. I'm going to probably do some searching and ask brokers or people that know. More than likely, I'm not going to do anything about it. Just sort of file it away as something interesting I heard today. But if I look over to the table next to me and it's Warren Buffett sitting there, well, I could say, well, his opinion is equal to the other guy's opinion. Well, that's nonsense. Yeah. If Warren Buffett just said, "I've just found a sure thing," I'm going to get on my phone and call somebody and say, buy quick.
Right.
Well, both have an opinion. Why is it that one person, when they express an opinion, everybody scrambles into action, and someone else, everyone sits there without doing a thing about it? Well, it's because some people have a credibility about them. They have a track record of success. They have a track record of backing up their opinions.
Right.
They don't just express an opinion, but their opinion has proven over and over again to be factual and beneficial when you follow it. And so, especially I've noticed even in this political cycle that we're in right now, a lot of folks in primaries for the Democratic Party and so on, and you watch the same thing when the Democrats had primaries 4 years ago, that everybody's jockeying for some credibility. They want the stage. They want to somehow convince everybody else that they're the best leader, that they know best what the answer is and how to solve problems. And you may have a dozen people on the stage, all convinced or trying to convince you that they are the best leader, the best qualified. And how do you know? Just because they tell you they are? Because they have opinions? Because they wax eloquent? Sometimes the best leaders aren't necessarily the best orators.
Mm-hmm.
So someone may sound really sharp on the stage, but you start to unpack their ideas and it's nonsense. It's gibberish, but it sounded good when they said it. So the first thing, just to be a person of influence, is have something of value to say. And the way you have something of value is you do your homework, you study, you prepare, you pay the price. I mean, anybody can just start mouthing off an opinion.
Yeah.
But the opinions that matter are the ones that are backed up with research, with reading, with education, with searching and doing your homework and diligence and staying up late at night and getting up early in the morning to go the extra mile to make sure you've mastered the field and the subject. And I always admire people like that. If I'm watching a panel of experts on the news or something, they keep rolling out these people with opinions. And I think, well, my opinion is at least as well-informed as that opinion.
Yeah.
And then now and then they pull in someone that clearly knows what they're talking about.
There's an element of mastery.
Yeah. And so I would say whether you're working for a small company, large business, you're in a church, on an elder board, any place where you're in a leadership role, before you get to the meeting, make sure you've paid the price of knowing what you're talking about, doing your homework, being prepared. Just someone who shows up to every meeting fully prepared immediately has just upped their influence game significantly. And you can just always tell the person that did their homework ahead of time. And you just tend to listen to those people more. I teach periodically I'll teach a doctoral seminar on leadership. Everybody's supposed to have done their reading ahead of time and prepared. Some people don't necessarily do that, and it becomes obvious when they speak. And then there's other people, it's very clear that they have read, they've thought, they prepared, they brought notes with them. And I just watch the dynamic. When those people speak, everybody's paying attention. When someone just is talking, people are it's just filler.
Yeah.
And I would just say, if you want to be a positive leader who makes a difference, especially in American, Canadian society today, be someone that is prepared. When you open your mouth, make sure it's something of value. And second thing I'd say, which kind of goes right along with that, is if you don't have something of value to say, be quiet. I mean, it kind of goes without saying.
That.
Of course, there's the famous verse in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 28. It says, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he's considered perceptive. And I found that sometimes you can seem quite profound by just not jumping into every. And these guys I was describing who would come to these convention meetings, they would speak to every issue, and
they had an opinion on every.
And it never dawned on them that there's a couple hundred people in the room, and most of them have not commented on any of these issues, and yet here I am commenting on every one. Is there really value in me? Is there something I'm really contributing to every solitary issue here that compels me to have to always speak? And I was just a kid at the time, so I didn't really. It wasn't my place, but someone needed to take some of these guys aside and say, listen, people would respect you so much more if you just talk less. But you keep talking and talking and exposing the fact you don't know very much. And so what I would say is, listen, when it gets to a topic that you actually know something about, well, then don't drag it out, but speak to that. But if you have something of value to say, but if you over talk, then you're going to lose your credibility. And there's an interesting thing just kind of along with that. I remember when I was in seminary years ago, and I had my pastor at the time was giving some advice to young ministerial students like me, and he had said something I never forgot. He just said, even when it comes to things like making announcements in church, and for those pastors listening to the podcast today, there's a lot of churches where the pastor just makes the announcements. There'll be a potluck supper next Sunday. There's a women's missionary union meeting on Tuesday night, whatever, and they roll through the announcements. And I thought some really good advice that was given to me was, my pastor said, listen, you're also going to be talking about how people can find eternal life, how they can go to heaven when they die, how they can overcome the worst sin in their life. So if one moment you're telling people they ought to really bring a covered dish next Sunday to the potluck, and the next moment you're talking about their eternal destiny, why don't you, as the leader, focus on talking about the stuff that really matters, and let other people talk about the stuff that's of much less significance? And because if people hear you talking about stuff that they don't think is that important, if they're a man and you're talking about the women's gathering next Tuesday night, well, they're going to tune you out because that doesn't apply to them. And now you're describing the youth activity. Well, you're not a youth, so you tune them out again. You don't want people tuning you out, because then all of a sudden when you say something they really need to be listening to, you're already tuned out. So, so what he said is, get other people to make those announcements, get other people to do the talking on less important things, so that when you get up, people, okay, now the pastor is going to speak, or now the president, now the boss is going to speak. We've already heard all the secondary matters and issues. And what my pastor said is, if you don't make all the mundane, normal announcements. So if there is a huge thing, maybe your church is having a church-wide revival meeting and you want everybody to be there. Well, the pastor himself gets up and announces that one. And then everybody thinks, hey, the pastor doesn't normally make announcements. If he's actually personally going to encourage us to do that, it must really be important. But if you're announcing everything, then nothing is going to be considered important. And so there is a sense in which, as a leader, don't do all the talking. If you can get someone else to announce the logistics of this meeting, let them do that. Think to yourself, I want to just speak to the most important issues. It was said once, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, who, when they were forming the Constitution of the United States, he commented and said, now here's a room full of people from all the states at the time, all of them filled with opinions, all of them wanting to express their opinions. But it was noticed that Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, the comment was, they didn't speak very often, even though they're two of the most influential people in the room. Yeah. But when they did speak, he said they always spoke to the biggest issues at hand. And to those, they sort of put their shoulder to the obstacle and began to push with all their might. And he said they never spoke long. They didn't drag things out. They didn't chase after little petty minutia things. But when they rose to speak, everybody listened because they were going to address the big issues. And so if you're going to be a person of influence, it's a mistake to think if I do the most talking, then I must be the most influential. Just the opposite. You water down your influence with too many words. And so learn to speak less and learn to avoid talking about the secondary matters and save yourself for the most important. And so that people begin to realize, oh, Sam is actually, I haven't heard him speak all day, but now he's going to speak to this. So it must be really important, because it takes a lot to get him out of his seat and out of his slumber. And so exactly. Maybe one other just before the break is always tell the truth, regardless of how popular it is. I always think of Neville Chamberlain coming back after signing a treaty with Adolf Hitler. And he was waving his treaty that Hitler had signed, and he's saying, it's peace for our time, peace with honor, he said. And he desperately wanted it to be peace with honor, and he wanted everybody to agree with him. And Churchill was one of the only ones, of course, who said there's no honor in selling out, giving away a country to an evil dictator. That's not honorable, and it's not going to bring peace. And, of course, at the time, it made Churchill very unpopular. He's just an old fuddy-duddy, cranky guy that just wants war.
Warmonger.
And Churchill's like, no, but I'm just telling you the truth. And, of course, at first it made him very unpopular, but he became known as one of the only people that the common people believed when he spoke they were getting the truth, not just some varnished over, hopeful perspective on something.
Yeah.
And so it's like the famous story of the emperor has no clothes. Most people just don't want to mention the elephant in the room. Let's just go ahead and tell the boss what he wants to hear. But that doesn't mean that you take delight in being contrarian and being obnoxious and always pushing against common wisdom. But when you clearly have a conviction about what is right and what's true, if you develop a reputation that if they ask you, they're going to get the clear-cut truth, that's going to give you some clout, and that's going to give people a sense of confidence that they want to hear from you because they know they're going to get the facts.
Yeah.
And so those are at least three ways to begin with that you can become a kind of influential person that people really want to hear from.
3 ways and a lot of work.
Yeah.
For those first 3 points, and we'll be right back to digest a bit more.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is April 20th to 22nd, and registration is open now. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes. If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
Well, Richard, we've seen 3 ways how we can develop our influence as a leader, as a person. And I suspect there are a few others that you've got there that can also help us do that. I think if we were to end the podcast now, that would be, those 3 ways, doing your homework, having something valuable to say. If you don't have something valuable to say, don't say it. And then essentially being a person of integrity, speaking the truth.
Yeah.
I think that's plenty to marinate on, if you will. But we want to provide the most value to our listeners. Yeah. And so what else can we add to our quiver of
let me give you
influence?
two more arrows here before we're done. A 4th one is, and again, I'm thinking in terms of particularly of when you speak up. And a 4th one is be discerning. And by that, I mean, you may have something to say, but just because you have something of value to say, you also need to discern when the best time is to say it. You can actually say the right thing, the truthful thing, but say it at the wrong time. I think that's why Jesus said in Matthew 7:6, don't cast your pearls before swine. What he was saying is you may know the truth, which would be a pearl, something precious, something of value.
Right.
But if you share that with people that don't value the truth, that despise hearing the truth or hearing God's wisdom, then all you are is you're just demeaning and diminishing the Word of God. And so Jesus was saying there's just times where people don't want to hear the truth, so don't waste your breath telling them the truth. They're going to just reject it and despise it anyway. And so that's one thing I've kind of learned is hold your fire until the right moment. There's some of the great battles were won because soldiers were told, don't shoot yet. When the enemy is charging across the field at you, you're tempted to want to shoot while they're still a long ways away, but you're not going to be accurate to hit them then. And so back in the centuries ago, when you're firing with muskets that weren't very reliable anyway, the officers would tell them, hold your fire, not yet. There'll be far more impact if you all shoot at the same time when they're at close enough range that you're gonna hit the target.
Right.
And so I find also when it comes to speaking, hold your fire until you can have the most impact. And sometimes that means waiting until later when other things have been said. So a lot of times we're eager to be the first one to speak. And of course, when you speak first, there is a certain amount of influence that comes from that.
Advantage.
You've kind of been the first person to leave an impression on others, but sometimes the last person or one of the later people is also of value because now you've heard all the different perspectives and you know how to address it. And so I remember one time, and I think I may have shared this before, where our denomination was considering a particular issue, and there was a man that was quite a dominant leader at the time who felt very strongly that they should all vote to do a certain thing. And he felt so strongly about it that he had taken a whole year and traveled all over the country, meeting personally with pastors and influencers to convince them of what he thought they should do. And so by the time we met to meet and to actually take the vote, he had talked to most of the people and was pretty sure that he had convinced everybody of his opinion. And so there he presents the formal presentation. Everybody seems positive. It looks like a slam dunk. It's going to happen. And then right at the very end, as they're just about to call for questions, someone rises up and says, I haven't heard a word from Henry Blackaby about this, and I just personally would like to know what Henry thinks. Well, my dad had been sitting quietly through the entire meeting, never said a word, just sat there. And now all of a sudden he's being called by someone who says, I don't really want to vote on this until I know what Henry has to say. Now that's influence. When you don't have to go to the microphone. People are asking for you to go to the microphone. And so my dad gets up and very briefly, very succinctly just says, I've got some concerns about this motion. I've got some concerns it's not biblical, the way that it's being done. I don't think it's practical, how it's going to work out. And I think it could be harmful. And I would personally, I would vote against it, but that's just me. And he went and sat down. Well, the only negative comment after an entire day of celebrating and talking it up, well, they took the vote and it lost. And everybody knew that the only reason it lost was because right at the end, my dad had been asked to speak and just told the truth, just said what he thought. Well, the man who'd been plugging it for a year was so upset that one comment from my dad could dismantle a year of his work traveling and promoting, that he actually got in his car and drove, it was like 15-hour drive back to where he lived, and just left the meeting, just didn't even stay till it was over. And then later complained that my dad was always using undue influence to influence everybody else. And it's like, you spent a year traveling all over the country plugging and my dad simply responded to a question, and he has undue influence and you don't. But I witnessed that, and I thought, well, that's what real influence is. You don't even have to go stand by the microphone or take your turn to speak. People will respect your opinion enough, they ask for it.
Yeah.
They don't even want to vote until they've heard from you. And the last one, just to say very quickly, is be Spirit-led, which really ought to be the first one. Ephesians 5, verses 16 to 18 says, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, don't be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. And basically what Paul's saying is these are very confusing times. Don't waste your time. Time is too precious to waste. So know what God's will is. And the way you know God's will is you be filled by the Spirit. You let the Spirit of God guide you. And that's something that every believer can do. It doesn't matter your IQ level. It doesn't matter how good of a speaker you are. It doesn't matter how high up in management you are. You can have just as much of the Holy Spirit indwelling you as anybody else does. Mm-hmm. And when you've got the Spirit of God within you, you have God within you who knows the future, who knows the issues. And so you can be wise beyond your years when you are listening to the Holy Spirit. And Paul said, but you've got to be filled by the Spirit. You can't just assume that because you're a Christian, that you're being guided by the Spirit. That requires you learning to listen and be guided and to be filled by Him. And that comes by regularly spending time with the Spirit. The reason that so many people wanted to hear from my dad was not that he was known as having the highest IQ, that he was just so high up in the organizational chart. They wanted to talk to my dad because they knew that my dad had talked with God, and it was obvious. And when you talked to my dad, you felt like you weren't just getting Henry Blackaby's opinion, but you were getting, you were talking to someone who was in regular communion with God Himself. And any of us can have that kind of clout because any of us can spend time with God regularly as well.
Well, this, all of these are just great, I think, points for each of for all of us to wrestle with and to just lay before our own lives and say if we want to have more influence, if we want to have any influence, how are we doing in all of these areas? And I think that's a great roadmap for anyone who's wanting to increase their influence. And shameless plug here, but speaking of increasing your influence, you're actually doing a seminar on this at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove coming up in April 6th to 8th.
It's not too late to register. And if you've never been to the Cove, it's awesome. And sometimes you just need to get away out of your normal life and schedule to think, and especially if you're just struggling right now to have influence in a particular area, maybe in your church or your family.
Or even clarity, And, I think the Cove is a great place for clarity.
Yeah.
It's outside of your normal place, and so I wasn't planning to necessarily plug that, but it just
segue.
It seemed too perfect not to mention. But
if you can make it, be sure to it's going to be an intimate setting. I'd love to be sure you come and meet me and talk to me, and maybe we can even just share a meal together. If you have a issue, maybe you're facing, I'd love to just talk with you about it.
I think that's the website is thecove.org, I think, or thecove.com.
Yeah, just look up those dates and you can register. And I think there's probably still a few spots in the actual the hotel there on campus, which is the best way to do that.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave it there.
Good.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.